The topic today is Pragmatism and the Good. And the format is this. I'm going to give a lecture for about a half an hour, and then we'll have open discussion. I'm hoping I'll be available to answer questions, but I hope it's not just a Q&A. I'm hoping it's going to be more of a discussion among all of us. So, pragmatism is a philosophical tradition that began in 1872 in meetings of the so-called Metaphysical Club, a philosophy discussion group at Harvard, and was dominant in the United States in the first quarter of the 20th century. Two of the founders of pragmatism, Charles Sanders Peirce and William James, were members of the club. The word pragmatism is derived from the Greek word pragma, which means action or a thing done, that is to say, the results of action. Although the term is often used today to denote the blunt desire to get results, or pragmatic. The founders of pragmatism, Charles Sanders Peirce, William James, and John Dewey, were subtle and perspicuous thinkers. It was not just the blunt desire to get results. Pragmatism rejects the idea that the function of thought is to describe, represent, or mirror reality. Instead, pragmatists say that the function of thought is to be an instrument or tool for prediction, action, and problem solving. Pragmatists contend that most philosophical concepts, such as the nature of knowledge, language, concepts, meaning, belief, science, are all best viewed in terms of their practical uses and effects, rather than in terms of representational accuracy. In this lecture, I will apply the pragmatic approach to the nature of goodness. I'll look at what goodness looks like on the ground, so to speak, in practical, concrete terms. I'll also look at what implications of this account of goodness has for ethics and morality. So the American pragmatist William James distinguishes between two approaches to philosophical questions: rationalism and empiricism. Rationalism starts with a grand idea or first premise, although different philosophers start with different premises, and derives by logic or some other method a system that purports to include the whole world in its conceptual scheme. This camp includes Descartes, Kant, Leibniz, Hegel, and many others. Empiricism starts with our experience and builds up its conceptual scheme from observation of regularities of behavior of the things we see, hear, and touch, and from the commonalities and differences we find among them. This camp includes Locke, Berkeley, Hume, Bacon, and others. In the ancient world, the distinctions were not so pronounced, but Plato's more on the rationalistic side and Aristotle more on the empirical side. James calls the rationalist tender-minded and the empiricist tough-minded, and he clearly prefers the tough-minded. The tender-minded, says James, favor ideas that seem appealing and tend to be monistic and dogmatic. They start with an explanatory principle and interpret everything in light of it. The tough-minded favor facts and tend to be pluralistic. They are not dogmatic. Instead, they are open to new evidence and are skeptical of having final answers. They make sense of the world via their perceptions and build up explanatory principles rather than starting with them. So instead of starting with principles, you build them up from what you observe. So the subtitle of James's book, Pragmatism, is a new name for some old ways of thinking. But pragmatism is more than just a new name. The old ways he speaks of are those of the empiricists, whose tough-minded approach relies on abstracting general principles, the laws of nature, from experience, not on positing general principles prior to experience. What's new in pragmatism is a method for helping the empiricists understand what they're talking about. Pragmatism started out as a method for determining what concepts mean. The pragmatic maxim, first defined by James's friend and colleague C.S. Peirce, is this: consider what effects that might conceivably have practical bearings we conceive the object of our conception to have. Then our conception of these effects is the whole of our conception of the object. James's formulation is similar. James says the pragmatic method in such cases, he's talking about settling metaphysical disputes. The pragmatic method is to try to interpret each notion by tracing its respective practical consequences. So both formulations are theories of the meaning of concepts by appeal to effects and consequences. Peirce gives some examples. To call a thing hard simply means that it's not easily scratched. To call something heavy simply means it'll fall unless something gets in its way. These are fairly trivial, but consider the concept of force. Some think force is some kind of entity or energy that causes motion. Peirce says that such an idea is superfluous. There are precise mathematical methods for describing the changes in motion that come about through the application of various forces. Peirce says that that's all there is to the concept of force. We don't need to posit some other mysterious entity behind the effects. There's nothing to the concept other than the mathematically describable effects of changes in motion. Says Peirce, the idea which the word force excites in our minds has no other function than to affect our actions. And these actions can have no reference to force otherwise than through its effects. If we know what the effects of force are, we are acquainted with every fact which is implied in saying that a force exists, and there's nothing more to know. James applies this concept, this method, to the concept of substance. We think of substance as something separate from its attributes, something in which the attributes inhere, but James says that's a mistake. A piece of chalk, for instance, is white, cylindrical, friable. Friable means easily crumbled into pieces so you can leave marks on the chalkboard, and insoluble in water. But what is chalk itself, apart from these attributes? James says nothing. The collection of attributes that cohere together is all there is to chalk. More generally, concerning anything material, he says, matter is known as our sensations of color, figure, hardness, and the like. They are the cash value of the term. The difference matter makes to us by truly being is that we then get such sensations. By not being, we lack them. These sensations then are its sole meaning. So, pragmatism is a theory of meaning. Both Peirce and James went on to develop the theories of truth, but in this lecture I don't discuss those further developments. We're not talking about truth. I'm sorry, those of you who have opinions about the pragmatic notion of truth. We're just going to bypass that for tonight. We're just going to focus on meaning, which is where the whole thing started. Instead of looking at truth, I want to look at the meaning of another concept, that of goodness. What I'm about to say is not found specifically in Peirce or James, but it is an application of their pragmatic method. So, historical methods of historical conceptions of the good. Let's start by considering a purely rationalistic account. Plato in the Republic speaks of the good as a perfect, eternal, and changeless form or idea. The Greek word is eidos, existing outside space and time, in which particular good things, such as knowledge, share. Now, I said form or idea. The term idea here does not mean something merely mental, as it does in modern English. It means something like a mental idea, but subsisting on its own. So these forms or ideas, they have some kind of existence outside space and time. The idea of the good, he says, is what gives truth to the objects of knowledge and the power of knowing to its knower. But it is beyond both known and knower. Plato says, this is coming from Plato's Republic, the objects of knowledge not only receive from the presence of the good their being known, but their very existence and essence. Though the good itself is not essence, but still transcends essence in dignity and surpassing power. Now, what's he talking about here? Plato's model of knowledge is based on our apprehension of unchanging abstract entities, such as geometrical forms. We have an idea of a pure right triangle, which is down in the lower left of the slide here, with perfectly straight lines and an angle of exactly 90 degrees. Even though every existing triangle has slight irregularities, the lines to the right of the little triangle are, I blew up, expanded the drawing of the triangle, and you can see that it's actually not all straight lines. They're sort of wiggly and got holes in them and stuff. That's what's in the real world. But the idea of the right triangle is perfect, immutable. It's always exactly 90 degrees, always has exactly straight lines, so forth. We can define the right triangle precisely, but every time you think of it, it's the same. Plato finds this constancy so appealing that he models all of reality on it. There's a realm of ideas or forms that are perfect and unchanging. That realm is superior to our everyday world, which is constantly changing. We recognize things in the world because they somehow inhere in or partake of or imitate the realm of forms. We recognize good things because they partake of the form of the good. The form of the good is what's really real, says Plato, and all the good things we come across are only derivatively so. The problem with this notion of the good is it doesn't give us any practical advice on how to find or create or produce good outcomes. It has no predictive power. From a pragmatic point of view, it's entirely vacuous. Oops, there we go. Plato's student Aristotle has a more down-to-earth view. Instead of some perfect form of goodness, he asks, what is good for human beings? He's like Plato in a way because he asks about the highest good for human beings, but he goes about his inquiry by looking at actual people rather than contemplating abstract ideas. Aristotle claims that as a factual matter, human beings seek happiness. The Greek term is eudaimonia. It's either eudaimonia or eudaimonia. I've heard both pronunciations. But eudaimonia, sometimes translated as flourishing above all else. Since we always choose it because of itself, he says, never because of something else. What he means here is this. We seek good food, health, pleasant company, intellectual stimulation, and the like because they make us happy. But we don't seek happiness because it leads to anything else. It's a final goal or end for us. So Aristotle's account of goodness is much more useful than Plato's because we can actually investigate the matter and find out what leads to our happiness or flourishing. Obviously, Plato's more in the rationalistic camp. Aristotle's more in the empirical camp. Plato's more tender-minded. Aristotle is more tough-minded. So with that historical background, let's take a look at what the concept of goodness entails pragmatically. What are the practical effects of something's being good? What difference does being good as opposed to not being good make? There are actually quite a number of meanings of the term good, quite a number of language games we can play with it, as it were. One dictionary lists over 50 definitions. Here I focus on one of the most common, captured in the phrase, good for. I am not going to deal with goodness in a moral sense, as in good versus evil. That's a whole separate subject. And a lot can be said about it, but I'm not talking about tonight. But I'm talking about the concept, what's good in the sense of good for. What's good in this sense has to do with benefits. Something that benefits something or someone is called good for that thing or person. We can think of this instrumentally or biologically. Instrumentally, a hammer is good for pounding nails, and what's good for the hammer is what enables it to do so well. Biologically, air, water, and food are good for living beings. Instrumentally, what is good for a thing enables that thing to serve its purpose. To make sense, an instrumental usage requires reference to somebody's purpose or intention. Thus, a hammer is good for pounding nails. We pound nails in order to build things, such as furniture or housing. Our intention is to acquire the comfort and utility these things afford us. That's our goal or end, and the good is what helps bring it about. The instrumental usage is expressed in terms of usefulness or utility for achieving a purpose or intention. Some hammers are better than others in that they have better heft or weight or balance, and thus can be used to pound nails more effectively. The instrumental usage leads to the biological usage. Why is it good for human beings to have comfort and utility? Because comfort and utility nourish us and keep us alive. The biological good has to do with health and well-being. Biologically, what's good for an organism is what helps it survive and thrive, and what nourishes it. Some things are better for us than others in this respect. For instance, a diet of whole grains and vegetables is better in the sense of providing better health for humans than a diet of simple carbohydrates and fats. Another example, some plants need full sunlight to thrive and others need shade. Thus, full sunlight is good for the former and shade is good for the latter. The good in this sense is that which enables a thing to function well, that is, to survive, thrive, and reproduce. Unlike the instrumental usage, the biological usage does not require reference to conscious purpose or intention. So you can talk about what's good for a plant, what's good for an animal, without ascribing any intention to the plant or animal. Just as an aside, the notion of function is non-trivial, and I've dealt with it elsewhere being on my blog, bmeacham.com/blog. Just you go there and search for function, and you'll find a couple things I've written about it. Here, I just want to say that the function of a living thing is intrinsically to survive and reproduce. Living things also have functions external to themselves in their habitat or biosphere, such as to provide shelter or nutrients or other goods to other living beings. But here I'm talking about function in the intrinsic sense. The function of a living being is to survive and reproduce. If they didn't survive, they wouldn't be able to do any of their other functions. Now, the instrumental usage intersects the biological when we consider what's good for something that it is itself good for achieving a purpose or intention. For instance, keeping a hammer clean and sheltered from the elements is good for the hammer. If it gets too dirty to handle easily or too rusty to provide a good impact on a nail, it's not useful as a hammer. So we can talk about what's good for the hammer in a way that is analogous to what's good for a living being. The good in this sense also is that which enables a thing to function well. Function in this case means what the hammer is designed to do. Just as good is defined in relation to an end, the value of the end is defined in relation to another end. As mentioned above, hammer is good for driving nails. Driving nails is good for building houses. We build houses to have shelter and warmth. We desire shelter and warmth because they sustain our life. Now here's a point that will become important shortly. This chain of goods and ends stretches in both directions from wherever we arbitrarily start looking. Hammer is good for driving nails. Driving nails is good for building things. That's one direction. The other is what's good for the hammer, which is whatever enables it to perform its functions. It's not good to leave it out in the rain. It is good to handle it carefully, swing it accurately with grace and force, put it away safely. In all of these things, pragmatically, both the instrumental and the biological usage of the term good give meaning to the term good by referring to the consequences or effects of an action or event. That whole grains are good for humans means that the effect of eating them is healthful. That a hammer is good for pounding nails means that using it for that purpose is likely to have the effect you want, namely that the nails go in easily and straight. Some synonyms for good are helpful, nourishing, beneficial, useful, effective. Some synonyms for bad are the opposite of these terms: unhelpful, unhealthy, damaging, useless, ineffective. Goodness is contextual, and there are degrees of goodness and its opposite, badness. Some plants, sunflowers for instance, need full sunlight to thrive. Others, such as violets, need shade. So sunlight is good for the former and not so good, full sunlight is good for the former and not so good for the latter. If the context is raising sunflowers, then full sunlight's good. If the context is raising violets, then it's bad and shade is better. So goodness is not absolute, contra Plato and the rationalists. What's good for the hawk is not so good for the mouse. The good in this sense is a feature of the natural world. One of the benefits of this empirical and pragmatic approach to goodness is that we can tell what's good by observation. Benefits and harms are publicly observable, and judgments about what's good are objectively verifiable. We can do studies of the effect of diet on health, for instance. Studies that provide factual evidence of the recommendation to eat vegetables and whole grains is not just someone's opinion. In particular, our knowledge of goodness does not depend on some kind of mystical intuition of a supersensible form existing outside space and time. The evidence is not hidden. It's there for all to see. I've been speaking about goodness for. I want to mention briefly a related sense of the term good, to be good at. Being good at something means to be proficient, accomplished, or skilled. For instance, a horse can be good at running, and one that is superlatively good at running will win races. A person can be good at any number of things, such as music, or tennis, or mathematics, or philosophy, or poetry. The connection between goodness at and goodness for is that what something's good at gives us clues as to what is good for it. I've said that what's good for a person or thing enables that person or thing to function well. We can think of what we're good at as our function, or at least one of our functions. Functioning well means doing what we're good at and doing it in a way that promotes and enhances our ability to do it. So the practical import of all this is that we now have a way to achieve what Aristotle calls eudaimonia, however you want to pronounce that. We experience eudaimonia, that is happiness, fulfillment, or flourishing, when we function well. So if we want to flourish, then we need to find out what our functions are. That is, what we're good at, and learn to do them effectively. Now, there's things that some of us are good at and others are not. Some have special talents for sports, for instance, or mathematics or music, but not everyone does. On an individual level, we each need to find out what we're good at personally or idiosyncratically and pursue and develop those talents. There are also things that everybody's good at by virtue of being a human being, just by virtue of being human. The philosophical task is to find the function of human beings in general. As Aristotle puts it, perhaps we shall find the best good, by which he means happiness, if we first find the function of a human being. For just as the good for a flautist, a sculptor, and every craftsman, and in general for whatever has a function and characteristic action, seems to depend on its function. So, just as the good for whatever has a function seems to depend on its function, the same seems to be true for a human being, if a human being has some function. Human being has a function. So the Greek word for function is ergon, or work, from which we get our term ergonomics. So what is the characteristic function or work of human beings, just as human beings? Well, I'm not going to answer that question here, because I've written the whole book about it. And I invite you to take a look at the book. It's available at my website, bmeacham.com. Clearly, it would be useful to find out. So that's something we can discuss later during the discussion, if you like. To conclude, I want to mention one more idea from William James. In one of his essays, he applies the pragmatic method to the question of whether the world as a whole is one or many. Excuse me. Obviously, it contains many things, but can they be considered altogether as one? Pragmatically, one way in which it is meaningful to say that the world is one is that the world contains causal connections and networks of influence that bind each separate thing to others. James says everything that exists is influenced in some way by something else. All things cohere and adhere to each other somehow, and the universe exists practically in reticulated or concatenated forms, which makes of it a continuous or integrated affair. Any kind of influence, whatever, helps to make the world one. In another place, he says, there can be no difference anywhere that doesn't make a difference elsewhere. James is making a metaphysical point here, asserting a characteristic of all of reality, that everything is connected to everything else. There can be no difference anywhere that doesn't make a difference elsewhere. Now, recall that I said that just as goodness is defined as in relation to an end, the value of the end is defined in relation to another end, and that the chain of goods and ends stretches in both directions from wherever we arbitrarily start looking. Following James, I assert that there is no finality to the chain of goods and ends, no summum bonum, or highest good, in which all chains culminate or from which all goods are derived. My claim is that the world is a web, not a hierarchy. Assuming that we seek to flourish, the fact of being embedded in such a web has implications for how we should conduct ourselves. Since everything is connected, our actions not only have an effect on our surroundings, but our surroundings rebound and have an effect on us. Hence, it is prudent to have a good effect on our surroundings. The underlying principle taken from permaculture, and by the way, if you haven't heard of permaculture, look it up. Permaculture is the coolest thing about designing healthful habitats and human communities. But anyway, the underlying principle taken from permaculture, a study of systems theory applied to ecosystems, is that an element of a system thrives when the system as a whole is healthy. And a system as a whole is healthy when its constituent elements thrive. Human beings are elements in a variety of systems, most notably our natural environment and systems of other people or communities. If, for instance, in situations of conflict, we can find ways to benefit all concerned, then we ourselves will be benefited. If conflict is resolved so that everyone is satisfied, then the solution will be likely to last, leading to further benefit for ourselves. Short-sighted, egotistical selfishness is self-defeating. The advice here is to seek goodness for as many concerned as possible. Doing so is a strategy based on enlightened self-interest. So what I'm saying is, if we want to thrive, to maximize our own good, it makes sense to try to maximize the good for all concerned in whatever situation we find ourselves. Another way of saying this is that it's good to be of service, to help everybody as best we can. As we maximize the good of everybody and everything in the environment, we thereby promote our own health as well. The advantage of the pragmatic approach to goodness is that now we know what goodness is. If we're smart enough to choose to do so, we can maximize goodness for all concerned. Okay, that's the end of my prepared lecture. Here's my contact information. I'm going to put this on the chat box here. The text of this lecture is on my blog, so you're welcome to go there and read the whole thing that I just said. If you want to be notified when I publish something new, just email me and ask to be on my email list. And now I'm going to quit sharing the screen.